All right.
Good morning, all, and good afternoon if you're coming from Australia. And welcome all to our third Environmental Law Champions. Sorry, I'm just getting a little bit of feedback. Welcome to our third lecture in this series from our Environmental Law Champions, our Asian Development Bank Train the Teachers program. And today we're very excited that we're going to be joined by Patty Moore, who I will introduce in a short while. But first, I would like to invite Angelo to just present a short video, an introduction about the Trainers Asian Development Bank Environmental Law Champions program. Can I also ask if it's possible to keep your microphones on mute? It's good to see people here with their cameras. It's nice to see faces on the virtual platform, but if you could keep your microphones on mute for the duration of the talk. And then after the talk with questions and answers, there will be the possibility to either write a question in the chat box or put up your hand or open your mic and be called upon to ask a question. But first, we would certainly like to introduce the Asian Development Bank Train the Trainers Environmental Law Champions program. So Angelo, if you're able to play the video, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Can everybody see the screen?
Yes, we can.
When I first heard about the TOT program, I was a bit skeptical because I thought that I'm teaching for nearly 2 decades. What else they are going to teach me? But after coming here, I'm really surprised that there are so many things to know and to learn and to adopt for myself.
I'm happy to report that, ever since I came back from the TTT in Manila, the number of students has increased. The first set of students which I taught in 2015 after I came back was 4 students. And the next semester, the registration went up to 30 students. That was the maximum limit. And ever since then, it was holding steady between 25 to 30. And the students themselves came back to me and said that this is the first elective subject that they have enjoyed.
I mean, the great value that I've seen of this TTT program is really the networking. They've now developed networks which have been fantastic, and they've been exposed to other environmental law professors within their region, and they're doing amazing things.
What is surprising to me, it is that after the TTT, several of our professors started another group. That is not for the environmental teachers alone, but also for the Environmental Protection Agency, the local people who really go to the polluters to find. I never realized there were so many practical questions that has to be answered. And what chemicals is toxic, why it is toxic, what's the legal basis, how much I should fine. That's also not only benefit those officials, but also benefits the teachers, because that's the real things, the real world. It's amazing. And I think the group is growing.
By focusing on training the trainers, we create the infrastructure to ensure that this growing demand for environmental law knowledge is going to be satisfied. I think this has been probably the biggest success that the Academy has had to date, because they've succeeded in mobilizing professors from all over Asia at a time when there's such a huge demand for improving environmental law, And yet nearly all these universities lack the capacity to be able to teach environmental law because they didn't have people who had the specialized knowledge that the environmental law field requires.
After this ADB TTT program, I told my students, go to an affected area, meet the stakeholders, and find out why exactly is this problem. For example, there was a lake nearby which was being encroached by a lot of illegal occupants. So two guys went there and met the residents. They went to the elected representatives of the municipal bodies. They went to the government officials who are responsible for protecting the natural resources. So the moment when they reached the government officials, they got a point that these students are really going to make it a big issue. And therefore, the government immediately acted upon this issue, and they cleared all the encroachments and they built a wall around the lake to protect it permanently. I think this is a small victory as a teacher that I could inspire my students to do such a thing. The change should start from each and every one of us.
Look, it's been inspirational, frankly. I've found myself totally inspired by the commitment, the enthusiasm and the capacity of the people that we've been very fortunate to locate. So we're actually building a bottom-up resource now of environmental law teachers, and to which we're adding all the new people that are coming in through the training, mixing with the more older, experienced teachers in their own country, and building a whole base there to carry this work on well into the future, and which I think is one of the most exciting things of all, to see that this project has a lifetime, a longevity and a sustainability beyond the actual training.
Matthew, sorry, you're on mute.
Thank you very much. Still something that carries from 2020 into 2021. You're on mute. So look, thank you very much, Angelo, and thank you everyone for watching that video. It's a short video that explains the work that has been going on with the Train the Teachers project, a program that continues over this year. And is designed not only to reach out to the environmental law professors, but also to environmental law lawyers and environmental law students. So that's hopefully some of the things that will be going on in this year. And so one of the projects that we've undertaken is this Environmental Law Champions lecture. And it's designed, this lecture series is designed to promote particular topics in environmental law that are relevant to our region. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome you to the third of this series. It was started by Professor Ben Bohr, and then 3 weeks ago by Dr. Jonathan Lillebad from the Australian National University, who spoke on human rights and the environment. And so today we're very privileged to have Patty Moore with us to talk about biodiversity law in the Southeast Asian region. So Patty is an environmental lawyer with more than 28 years international experience, working in the field of environmental law and governance across more than 30 countries in Africa, Asia, Europe and Latin America. She has been living and working in Asia since 1999, and much of her work is focused on building the legal basis for conserving and sustainably using biological resources. Patty was a member of the team that developed the IUCN guidelines for protected areas legislation, and most recently in Southeast Asia, she was part of the team that has drafted a new decree on protected areas for Lao PDR. Since 2010, she has worked with ADB to carry out assessments of the legal basis for environmental and social safeguards for more than 30 countries in the Asia Pacific region. She has been working with UNICEF, United Nations Environment Programme, and the United Nations Human Rights Commission on children's rights to a healthy environment in the Asia Pacific region since 2018. She is a true environmental law champion, and it's a great pleasure that we welcome her on this Saturday morning to give us a presentation on biodiversity laws in Southeast Asia. Thank you very much, Patty. The screen, as they say, is yours.
Thank you, Matthew. Now let me see if I can give you a screen here. And there, can you see it?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, well, it's on my screen, so let's see. let me try something else. Yeah, because we tested this earlier and it worked perfectly. And now,
I could share the screen from my side, and you could just let me know if I should shift over to the next one.
okay, well let me try one more time here and see if this works.
And as we say, we can assure everyone it was working 15
Yeah,
months ago.
it was working perfectly 15 minutes ago. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can
Yep.
you-
Yeah, we can see the screen.
You've got it. Okay, now.
Thank you, Patty. Perfect.
Okay, sorry everybody. Anyway, thank you. Good morning here in Bangkok. Good afternoon, and even good evening. I know there's some people who are joining in, at their evening time. First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much to ADB and the IUCN Academy of Environmental Law for inviting me to do this. It's as Matthew explained, it's work that I've been doing for a while, and it's really an opportunity to be able to connect with a lot of you who are doing the same kind of work and more. And I hope actually that maybe after this we could even get into a little bit of a discussion about it, as much as that's possible with this kind of a format. Talking about biodiversity law specifically, because there are 4 biodiversity hotspots in Southeast Asia. There are 36 in the entire world. When you think that Southeast Asia is less than 1% of the total area of the world, and only about 3% of the land area of the world, and you think that it's got more than 10% of the biodiversity hotspots, it gives you an idea of why we need to be thinking about biodiversity law in Southeast Asia. So quickly, I'm going to run through constitutional provisions. We're going to look at biodiversity laws and the 3 components of biodiversity, which are ecosystems, species, and genes. And then we'll look at framework environmental laws in ASEAN, and then specifically focus on protected areas laws. And the reason we're going to do this is because it's been known for a long time that habitat fragmentation, degradation, and loss are the primary drivers of the loss of biodiversity. And protected areas are only one way that we can help stop that degradation and loss, but they're a very important way. So I think probably most people in this group know very well who the members of ASEAN are, but just for those of you who may not be familiar with it, there are 10 member states right now. You see them on the screen, and I'll just refer to them as AMS, or ASEAN member states, from now on. So now, just to start at the top of the legal hierarchy in each country, the countries that actually have constitutional provisions on biodiversity are Lao PDR, Thailand, and Vietnam. And you can see that all of these constitutions have been amended relatively recently, within the last 6 to 8 years. And they range from general provisions, like in Laos, that all citizens and organizations must protect biodiversity. That's echoed in Thailand. There's a duty to protect biodiversity. But Thailand also says the state must conserve biodiversity and minimize negative impacts on it. Vietnam goes a little further, even in its constitution, and says that anyone, the organization or individual that depletes biodiversity will be severely punished. So you can see there's a range of constitutional provisions, and some of them from the general to the fairly severe. Now, there are other ASEAN member states that have constitutional provisions that have to do with natural resources and or the environment, but that don't mention biodiversity specifically. Of this range, Lao PDR is one of the ones that mentions biodiversity and then makes specific references to natural resources as well. In general, the constitutional provisions on national resources are much more general than the provisions that we saw about biodiversity in the 3 constitutions, which got a little bit more specific. Some more, Thailand and Vietnam, again, like Laos, also have provisions on biodiversity as well as provisions on natural resources and the environment. And Myanmar and Philippines actually specify which parts of the country or which levels of national jurisdiction have the responsibility for legislating. In Myanmar, it's at the federal level, and in the Philippines, it's at the autonomous region level. Now, there are biodiversity laws and regulations specifically on biodiversity in a few countries. Myanmar is the most recent one in 2018. It regulates biodiversity at the level of ecosystems and species, but does not regulate the genetic resource aspect of biodiversity, which is biosafety and access to genetic resources. In Vietnam, the Biodiversity Law, which is now 13 years old, regulates both biosafety and ABS. In Cambodia, there is a biodiversity conservation corridor subdecree, but it is very specific and to corridors or connectivity, and it does not regulate biosafety or ABS. We see here that there are the great majority of the ASEAN member states have regulated biosafety. In some cases, like Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, there are multiple guidelines and decisions, decrees, lots of different levels of the legal hierarchy that do this. In 4 of the countries, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, and Malaysia, there's a specific law or regulation that regulates biosafety. For ABS, again, there are not quite as many countries have regulated ABS as have regulated biosafety, but the earliest one was the Philippines, and the Philippines actually was the first in the world with their order in 1995. Singapore regulates it only through research permits, which are done under different regulations. But the other countries have specific laws or decrees on biotechnology and access to genetic resources and benefit sharing. As far as the ecosystem component of biodiversity is concerned, all of the ASEAN member states have forest laws, with the exception of Singapore, predictably, which does regulate parks and trees. Aquatic ecosystems, again, are regulated by all ASEAN member states through their fisheries law, and that includes Lao PDR, which is landlocked, but which regulates freshwater fisheries through its fishery law, and then the other ASEAN countries which have coastline and which do have ocean jurisdiction, and they also regulate all aquatic resources through fisheries laws. Wetlands as an ecosystem type are regulated in 5 countries through different levels, whether it's through subdecrees, decrees, or law. And there's, we can discuss more about the fact that there is not really enough legislation that specifically protects and regulates wetlands and human beings' interaction with them. Species are regulated in one way or another in all ASEAN member states. There are 6 of the member states have specific laws on wildlife. In some cases, wildlife and habitats, but 6 of them regulate wildlife. Four countries use other laws to regulate wildlife or wild species. In Cambodia, it's a combination of the forestry law and the protected areas law. In Indonesia, there's a law on ecosystems and the resources in them. Myanmar, again, it's the newer Biodiversity Law, Protected Areas Act. And Vietnam uses both the biodiversity law and the law on forestry. The biodiversity in general environmental law and regulations is regulated in different ways. All of the ASEAN member states have general environment laws, all 10 of them. 3 of them have environment laws that specifically mention biodiversity conservation. They have enabling provisions. That's Indonesia, Lao PDR, and Vietnam. And then 6 ASEAN member states have provisions that specify protection for ecosystems as well. Now, Vietnam has just updated and amended its general environment law. The new law will come into force on January 1st of next year. And that new law will mean that there are 7 ASEAN member states whose environment laws have provisions on protecting ecosystems. To give you a little bit of a breakdown of how biodiversity is reflected in general environment laws. The 7 countries that have the general provisions are Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos PDR, Myanmar, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. And you can see that these laws range from 1988 in the Philippines with the Environment Code to the most recent, which is Myanmar with its 2018 law. 3 of the ASEAN member states have environment laws that are strictly what you would call environmental protection or pollution focused, and they don't have provisions on biodiversity or natural resources, either one. And that is Brunei, Malaysia, and Singapore. Now we're going to shift now and look specifically at the ecosystem aspect of biodiversity in ASEAN. And a lot of the resources for this part of the presentation are coming from work that we're doing by a project that is implemented by the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, which is based in the Philippines. One of the 4 biodiversity hotspots in the Southeast Asia region is one single country. It's the Philippines. It's just listed. When you look for the list of biodiversity hotspots in the world, the Philippines is listed all by itself as a country. So ASEAN Center for Biodiversity is headquartered there. It is one of ASEAN's 10 specialized centers, and it's part of the ASEAN Secretariat. We're also looking at ASEAN heritage parks, which were first declared in 1984. And now that the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity has come into existence more than 20 years after the first ASEAN heritage parks were declared, the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity is responsible for managing ASEAN's program on ASEAN heritage parks and for developing and managing the standards that ASEAN is setting for its heritage parks. The project that ACB is implementing right now is called Biodiversity Conservation and Management of Protected Areas in ASEAN, or BCAMP. It's funded by the European Union. It's focusing on mainstreaming biodiversity into all aspects of national planning, from education to overall strategic and economic development programs. And it's also looking very closely at ASEAN heritage parks. So we're going to first, to give you a little background of the review that we did to try to understand the status of protected area law in ASEAN. We used as a basis IUCN's guidelines for protected areas legislation. These are the only guidelines specifically for protected areas law. The CBD Secretariat has not issued anything similar because it works very closely with IUCN, and IUCN has already done this since the early 1980s. When we're looking at protected areas laws, there's a protected area law or decree, a very specific one, in 8 of the ASEAN member states. The only ones that don't have a specific law or decree are Brunei and Vietnam. And for Vietnam, it's because there are different ministries that are responsible for managing their protected areas. So first, I think by now we all know that the world did not meet the Aichi biodiversity targets. If we look at it from the positive side, both globally and in the ASEAN region, they're partially met, at least in terms of percentage of coverage of protected areas. The target elements that are remaining to be met, and this is according to the UN Environment Program's Global Biodiversity Outlook number 5, which is essentially the report card on the Aichi biodiversity targets. What we're still looking for are identifying the areas of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem services, ensuring that those areas are effectively and equitably managed, that they are well connected, and that they are ecologically representative. Now, the first 3 are covered to some degree under national protected area systems. There are 4 countries, so fewer than half of the ASEAN member states actually have either explicitly or implicitly a national protected area system. One of the reasons that a protected area system is important, and one of the reasons that a system is highlighted in the Convention on Biological Diversity, is that with a system, it kind of forces us to look at what is part of the system. Are all ecosystems within a country represented within that system? And how well balanced are they? Where are resources going to support them? I know that there are some countries that argue it's not necessary to have a system as long as you have the protected areas, but there are great advantages to a system, and particularly to system planning and what that can tell us for individual protected areas also. Payments for ecosystem services are specifically regulated in 5, so half of the ASEAN member states: Indonesia, Lao PDR, Myanmar, Philippines, and Vietnam. And biodiversity corridors, or what is also known as connectivity, are also regulated by 5 ASEAN member states, but not the same ones. 3 of them are the same. Lao PDR, Philippines, and Vietnam recognize both payments for ecosystem services and connectivity. Cambodia and Indonesia also regulate corridors and connectivity. Now, when we get into the issue of whether protected areas are effectively and equitably managed, there are many aspects to this. As we've seen, because only 4 ASEAN member states have protected area systems, and only 2 of those are explicit, there's not much system planning being done in ASEAN member states as it is today. So there is site planning, however. So there are legal requirements for planning individual sites in most of the ASEAN member states, and you can see that, the list on the screen. Something that's very important for protected areas is whether or not they are integrated into land use plans. Because if land use planning is completely dissociated from protected areas planning, then it is likely or maybe like a given that there will be uses designated for protected areas simply because they're not even reflected on the plans that land use managers are working with. In Cambodia, it's only implicit in the land law that protected areas might be integrated. In Thailand, it's partial with specific types. And 3 other countries specifically integrate protected areas into land use planning. That's Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. Only 3 ASEAN member states require public participation in site planning. Now, there are more countries, you can see below, that require participation in actually establishing protected areas. But then once they're established, there are relatively few countries that require public participation in then planning how to manage the protected area. And there are even fewer that require public participation if there's any change to a protected area, or if a protected area is simply abolished. Only Cambodia and Thailand require the public to have any kind of involvement in making those decisions. As far as co-management of protected areas goes, the Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar specifically enable co-management in all types of protected areas. In the Philippines, it's implicit that this will be done, but it's not explicit and it's not a legal requirement. And in Vietnam, it's a requirement for marine protected areas only. It may be done. And what we're talking about here are not really what's done in practice. We know that in many countries, and not only in ASEAN, actions are taken in practice, every day on the ground that are not required by law. But what we're looking at here is actually what the law says. In other words, what government entities and citizens are required to do, and for which there is a penalty if you don't, or there are consequences if you don't. Community protected areas and what ICCAs, which mean indigenous and community conserved areas, are enabled in the laws of 5 ASEAN member states. And interestingly enough, in Cambodia, it's not the protected areas law that does that, it's the land law that makes that possible. In the other 4 countries, they are enabled by the protected areas law or decree. Benefit sharing, in other words, can people who live in and around a protected area expect to receive any of the benefits from the protected area? And in 4 ASEAN member states, that's explicitly mandated by law in Myanmar, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. Again, a big part of effective and equitable management is financing. 5 countries create a fund of some kind for protected areas management. Most ASEAN member states allow donations to support protected areas management. Interestingly enough, in Brunei, it's cash only. I mean, some countries do allow in-kind contributions. Most of the other countries do. Something that is very important for individual protected areas is the ability to retain income that they generate, whether they generate them through entry fees that people pay to actually visit the park, whether they're fees for licenses for camping or for using video equipment or for something else. In many countries, all revenue that's generated by a protected area by law must go back to the central treasury or the national treasury. And then it's not always easy or straightforward to then have the money sent back to the protected area. In 4 countries, there is some mechanism that allows protected areas to retain their income. In both Cambodia and, 5, in both Cambodia and Indonesia, that's site specific. Some protected areas can, others cannot. It depends on the regulation for that protected area. But Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam specifically allow protected areas to retain the income that they generate. The other countries require it to go back to the central treasury. All ASEAN member states, except for Brunei, have a legal requirement that the polluter must pay for any damage caused or even degradation caused in some cases. And that includes in protected areas. Incentives for compliance. What we have in the laws of the ASEAN member states are not exactly incentives. I mean, Brunei, Malaysia, and Myanmar provide protection for informants. In other words, if it's sort of whistleblower protection. If someone sees that there's something happening, some illegal activity, anyone who reports that can be protected in some way. Lao PDR makes it possible to give a reward for performance with respect to protected areas. And those rewards can go to the general public, but other countries have rewards for government staff that perform very well in doing their jobs. But there are very few actual incentives for the general public to comply. And if we think back about the number of countries that allow communities around protected areas to receive benefits from the protected areas, we see that they kind of, it's not going back. Wait a minute. Yes, benefit sharing. So you can see there are 4 countries that enable benefit sharing, and very few that provide incentives for as incentives for compliance. And as far as the enforcement side of managing equitably and effectively managing protected areas, all of the ASEAN member states give administrative enforcement powers to the to whether they call them the wardens or the guards or the rangers in protected areas. And the majority of ASEAN member states also give police powers to protected area staff. And police powers means the power to stop, the power to arrest, and if necessary, the power to seize things that were used in the commission of a violation. So finally, looking over this, what are ASEAN member states doing to protect biodiversity, to conserve it and sustainably use it, and particularly the ecosystems? So all ASEAN member states have regulated either ecosystems or species or both, and that was even before 1992. So before the Convention on Biological Diversity. Since the CBD came into force, all ASEAN member states have amended their existing laws or they've adopted new laws. 5 or half of the ASEAN member states have regulated biosafety and ABS. So, five states have regulated biodiversity generally and biosafety and access to genetic resources and benefit sharing. 3 of those have regulated only biosafety. So when we're looking at an overall report card for the Aichi biodiversity targets, ASEAN member states, if you're looking at it from the glass is half full, then we're halfway there, or we're partially there. It's partially regulated. There is much more to be done, and what we hope is that the work that we've been doing on protected areas laws will give ASEAN member states an idea of what they can do and where states share boundaries and share ecosystems, where they may be able to find ways to harmonize some of their regulations so that there would be more effective management and conservation of protected areas and biodiversity. A couple of things that you all may know about or may not. IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, has created what is called an ecosystem red list. You may be familiar with the red list of species, which assesses whether individual species are endangered or not. And there are different categories of endangerment. Now the IUCN has done the same thing for ecosystems, and they have now completely assessed 21 countries, which is a small percentage of 192 countries in the world, but at least they're starting. And there are some countries, and Australia is one of them, that have done a great deal of work on assessing specific ecosystem types. IUCN has also created a green list, which is not so much an assessment as it is a standard for effective and equitable management of protected areas. And countries have begun to apply to be recognized as have their individual protected areas recognized and added to this green list. So there are more and more different ways that are becoming available for countries to get information about this and about different ways to do this, and also to think about how they may be able to increase their legal protection of biodiversity, protected areas, and the species and genetic resources. Now, there's another webinar, not part of this series, but it's one that may be mentioned that will be coming up next week, looking specifically at wildlife law. That I'm also working with that initiative, and it is updating a manual that was created in 2015 for ASEAN on wildlife law. So 6 years later, the the initiative is on with the ASEAN Secretariat. We're not as far into that analysis as we are the one with protected areas laws, but once the handbook is available, it will be generally available through the ASEAN Secretariat to anybody who's interested. So I'd like to thank you for your time this morning, and I look forward to questions and hope that we might even be able to get a little bit of a discussion going. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patty. So thank you very, very much, Patty. I've also just added a link to that free event, which is on Wednesday morning, Bangkok and Philippines time, on the wildlife protection webinar. And we now have quite a bit of time for questions. Thank you very much, Patty. And we have a few questions already asked in the chat box. So I'm not quite sure if the Q&A or if the hand raise is working but if you want to ask a question, please feel free to sort of unmute or raise your hand, and I'll also try and come to you there. But I want to ask just the first question that came from Nico Magdao about the West Philippine Sea. And the question is, knowing how diverse the area is, what is the possibility of having cooperation among ASEAN member nations having specific claims over the region to create a protected area in order to protect biodiversity in the area? And I guess that's possibly could even be a broader idea about ASEAN cooperation for multicultural, multi-country areas, and perhaps the Coral Reef Triangle or the Heart of Borneo initiative. You could make some comments on that, please, Patty. Patty, you're on mute.
I apologize.
Sorry.
Okay. One of the reasons that the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity is doing this, this review of protected areas legislation, and also looking at the standards that ASEAN has set in the past for ASEAN heritage parks and updating those, is to try to provide a basis for ASEAN within the Secretariat to do exactly the kinds of things you're talking about. Whether it's looking at just bilateral agreements to manage protected areas on two sides of national borders, or whether it's looking at something broader in the seas. And I think those of you who are professionals in the ASEAN region, I would really encourage you to become more familiar with what the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity is doing, and encourage them to take these steps, particularly where with respect to marine biodiversity, but also with respect to terrestrial biodiversity, because I think we know that just the protocols within any kind of a regional entity can mean that things take a lot of time. And if there is citizen engagement, and particularly from the professionals and the experts within the region, that will also help to drive that kind of a process. But yes, and this is something that the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity is looking at, is very aware of, would like to do, and would definitely appreciate support for. That I can't pretend to speak for the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, but because I have been collaborating with them for several years on these issues, I know that this is something that's discussed within the ACB.
Thanks, Patty. And Anna Itkin, are you there? Would you like to come on and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I apologize. I can't turn on my camera at the moment, but thanks. My question is, and I believe maybe you partially at least answered, is that we know that indigenous communities play a very important role in conservation. And it's been recently published that in many places they were actually displaced under the premise of let's set aside this area for conservation. They were actually kicked out of their traditional land and homes. And I wanted to understand if there is something in laws and regulations that already is there or perhaps can be introduced to promote actually their integration, because once they are part of the conservation process, the outcomes are very good and much better than without, of course, and we eliminate the negative externalities on this community.
Yeah, I mean, what you've just said is an issue not only for ASEAN, but it's an issue around the world. That there's ample evidence that indigenous communities have conserved the natural resources that they count as part of their territory much more effectively than certainly we have in the industrial age. But as you saw from the review, there are only the 1/2 of the ASEAN member states even enable any kind of recognition of community or indigenous conserved areas. Now there may be some de facto instances, and each of you in your different countries may know of those, but until there is the opportunity for indigenous communities and other, sometimes they're just called traditional communities, to have recognition of the areas that they have been conserving and the territories that they have been conserving for millennia, it will be difficult for them, and there will be no legal basis for them to defend that. So these are the kinds of things that when you're looking at reform efforts with protected areas laws, or just a country's biodiversity law or environmental law, these are the times to get that kind of provision into your national legal framework. I know when the team that was working on a new protected areas decree for Lao PDR last year, that's one of the things that we worked very hard to get into the draft. As most of you probably know, what goes in a draft is not necessarily what is in the final law or regulation. But again, these are efforts that they've been going on for years, and they're going to be going on for many more years to come. And this will require the work of regional bodies like the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, and it will require the support of everyone in each individual ASEAN member state to do this, to make this case and to continue bringing it up until it is actually part of a country's national law.
Thank you. Can just focusing a little bit on that question of Indigenous issues, both in terms of land tenure within protected areas and also co-management. I'm wondering, how do declarations such as the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, issues such as free, prior, informed consent and that development, and even the idea of a human right for a safe, clean and healthy environment, give strength to that argument for legal protection or legal regimes to ensure that Indigenous people's rights are protected. Are these opportunities that can be used as well to then force that realignment or promote that realignment of biodiversity laws with those Indigenous rights laws?
Yes, of course, Matthew. That of course they are, but I think also everyone is aware that each country has its own legal system, its own regulatory system, and its own set of cultural norms that guide the way the country makes rules that to govern the way people interact with nature. And the way those tools are used will be very country specific. Do you know what I mean? That because there are some governments that may not react 100% positively to assertions of human rights. And I think it's an argument that can definitely be made, particularly in the case of indigenous and community conserved areas. And I think it will be as much in the art of persuasion and the way in which those arguments are made, as it will be in that to be able to at least get to the content. Because in some cases, simply raising an issue in a way that is provocative can close doors. So I think in many cases also, we need to learn to be better negotiators, better persuaders, and learn how to bring all of these diverse threads, human rights, environmental rights, like we could look at animal welfare, the rights that some countries are beginning to recognize for like living ecosystems and living things. All of these can be brought together, but they will need to be pulled in by the people in each country who understand the most effective way to make those arguments in that country's language, because the words can change, and in the cultural context, the legal and cultural context of each individual country. You can say a lot at the global and regional level, but when it comes right down to it, it has to be contextualized locally. That's my personal opinion. I feel like I do a lot of work at the regional level, global level, but it all comes down to the people who are working on the ground, which is all of you who are in this webinar right now.
Yeah, and your answer sounds like a lawyer who's worked for 20 years in Southeast Asia amongst 30 different countries. So I was going to ask Chen Kok On from Forever Sabah, would you like to come on? Because I think this then leads into your question. So please, if you would like to provide a question or a comment.
Yeah, thank you. I just saw I was following the presentation, and then I saw you mentioning Malaysia. I'm from Malaysia. So I just want to point out that due to the unique federal system of Malaysia, forests and in fact rivers and fisheries and all that, they are mostly under state jurisdiction. So if you're looking for federal legislation on forestry, for example, you might not find it. I pointed out in my comment that you should also look at the states of Sabah and Sarawak, because these two states are located on the Borneo Island. So they have their own separate forestry enactment, as well as other environmental protection law. Since I'm here, I would like to ask a question as well. In terms of the various biodiversity protection law in ASEAN, could you point to some specific examples of which country's law do you think is doing a fantastic job, that other countries can learn from? And specifically, I'm just wondering, other than protecting the area, the biodiversity hotspot, as so to speak, from intrusion, from being opened up, is there any other more innovative way to protect that area? At the same time, it could be put to productive use, and is there any example of countries which have done it well or relatively well? Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the. First of all, yes, I didn't go into detail on Malaysia, but for the review of protected areas law, we have definitely taken Sabah and Sarawak into account. The documentation analyzing Malaysia's law is probably the longest of all of them. You can imagine why. So it's all in there. But we have not done a similar evaluation only of forest laws. That's another issue. I mean, what we were working on for the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity was specifically focused on protected areas laws. With the work that's being done right now to update the ASEAN Handbook on Wildlife Law, pretty soon we'll have good overview of protected areas law, a good updated overview of wildlife law. And you're right, the same thing needs to be done for forest law. Lao PDR just in 2019, adopted a new forest law, which I believe is the newest in the region right now. So you're right, it's a good time to do that. And those of us who are working at the regional level need to think about that, getting together and see if we can find a way to make that happen. So thank you, you're right. Then who's doing everything really well? It's when you look at all of these, each country in its own way does at least one thing really well. Do you know what I mean? Maybe not everything really well, but does at least one thing pretty well. In terms of just a biodiversity law, an overall biodiversity law, Vietnam might be considered a good example for other countries to look at. That law is 13 years old now. It is in the process of being updated, but that updating process is taking some time. And I don't have a timeline yet on when it would be, when the amendment and the update would be available again. What I would say is what we will do when we finish the review of all of the ASEAN member states for protected areas laws, we will do a regional synthesis, and then that will also be available. And that, that a lot of what you saw in this presentation will be incorporated into that regional synthesis. There will be more, obviously, but I think I am very hesitant to say that there's any one country or any one law that should be a model for everybody else, because that's usually a very bad way to do things. You should never, don't copy. Do you know what I mean? You can take good ideas, but for every country, the good ideas that you take from other countries' practice, and what we saw in the video that opened this webinar, environmental law professors saying that they were taking good ideas from environmental law professors in other countries all over Asia Pacific, but they still have to go home and look at those good ideas in the context of their own national law and their own national regulations and their own curriculum. You can't just take what somebody else is doing and take it home and try to apply it. I mean, we know that there was an example of a country in the ASEAN region that had a very enthusiastic person who had studied abroad and liked the biodiversity law of the country where the minister had studied abroad, and thought it would be a good idea to just copy that law, change the name of the country. And he was dissuaded from doing that, let's put it that way. So I would say, be very careful of anyone who offers you a model. Be very grateful for people who give you access to good examples, and particularly to good examples that that have actually been tried and proven to work in practice. And I have to say something. I can see Amado Tolentino, who I haven't seen in years, smiling as I say this. And so Amado, you can come in and second me on this, I think. No? Also, what Chen Kong, what you were asking is, are there other ways to do this? There are OECMs, other effective conservation measures, right? And those have really only been studied, looked at, analyzed, tried to apply in the last 5 or 6 years. So the CBD Secretariat has done some work on OECMs. The ASEAN Center for Biodiversity is also doing work on OECMs. But those are going to be they won't only be country specific, they'll be site specific. Because the other effective conservation measures that can be taken, there may be a range of measures that have been tried in different places, but there might be only 1 or 2 out of that whole range that would be appropriate for a particular site or a particular area. But I'll look in a minute and see if I can get the link. But if you go to the CBD Secretariat website, and search for OECM or other effective conservation measures, I believe there's at least one CBD technical publication on that, at least one right now that you could use for a reference.
Thanks, Patty. And I have a question from Miku Lagade. Miku, thank you.
Yeah, hi. Oh, can you see me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I'm having really bad internet connection, so I'm not sure. I want to ask about a lot of the things you said that interlinks everything. So this is regarding OECM. Does that take into account indigenous experiences? Because the debate now in like environmental peace building, for example, is that on one hand, there is a premium to be said on taking in scientific ways of healing the area, for example, because you need scientists to be able to tell in the South China Sea, this is the amount of destruction that happened. On the other hand, the flip side of the debate is that you also need to take into account indigenous experiences of managing environment, because if you just prioritize the technocratic turn in peace building, for example, then you're also marginalizing the voices of those who have been doing the same management and conservation that are effective in the past. So when these two ideas clash, how do you balance out those seemingly competing interests? And this reminds me of like, right now I live in Australia, and during the bushfire, this conversation became even more in your face, so to speak, since the common way of thinking about burning forest fires is that it's bad for the environment, carbon, etc. But then the indigenous have been doing it to prevent even bigger fires. So just thinking about the maybe scientific Western way and excluding indigenous experiences wouldn't really complete the picture. So in the sense that they conflict, how is the balance to be made there?
Yeah, Ideally, your regulatory system, your law and your regulations would at least give you the basis for making that balance. But frequently, what we see, and it's seen as a positive thing, is to say science-based decision making. Do you know what I mean? In other words, to try, as opposed to political-based decision making. It's what we're hoping for. No, but as you so rightly point out, science-based decision making very often excludes knowledge that is very definitely scientific, because it has been tried and proved over much longer than anybody's been studying these things systematically in the industrial age. And what I can say is that, again, it would be ideal to be able to have that enabled in a country's regulatory system. Do you know what I mean? And have consequences for not doing it. That's not the case in most cases. As we saw, there are few, very like less than half of ASEAN member states that even recognize or enable indigenous and community conserved areas. So there's a big, there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, just to bring the governments of ASEAN member states around to the idea that there is value in recognizing these. No,
it's more of mainstreaming indigenous ideas.
And then mainstreaming is something that, I mean, the word, honestly, I think has been so overused that it's become almost meaningless. But when you're talking about trying to mainstream traditional knowledge into decision making, anything that you do, what that's going to take, again, is going to be very, very country specific and very local, because and local in some cases. Indigenous knowledge varies from indigenous group to indigenous group. It varies from country to country. It may be similar if there are similar species and different groups have learned to use similar species for similar purposes. Yes, no, but mainstreaming is something that also is a process. You like, unfortunately, some people think that if you just get something in a law or you just put it in a regulation, job's done, you know, you're finished, all your problems are solved. No, that's where you start, because then that is where you have to be sure that that law is then applied and enforced, whatever it says. So it's really two track for, you know, for all of us, you know, who are working in conservation. We want to be able to see that the measures that need to be taken for conservation are legally required, and that if you don't do it, and including if you are a state agency and you don't do it, there are consequences for not doing it. You know? But then
what if there, sorry.
So
go ahead.
Just as to follow up on what you mentioned, I think it's important not to be doing all these things. However, what if the law is not robust enough to be protecting this comprehensively? What if, like, in a jurisdiction where there is silence in the law? So how can we ensure that whatever conservation measures we're pursuing is actually beneficial, not just for the environment, but also for the communities in that environment?
Well, there are, as one activist in India found out, that, you know, there is substantial guidance available for, you know, for how communities can bring different kinds of issues, and it's environmental issues, human rights issues, what the tools you know that can be used are, and what some of the methodologies are. It can get you arrested in some countries. And again, that's why I'm saying most of this is it's very country specific, and in some cases it's very local. But, you know, if your laws are silent, then there are two things you need to do. You need to do what you can, you know, by keeping these issues in the public sphere, talking about them, bringing them up, talking with other people, expanding other people's awareness as much as you can. And you also need to try to change the laws. And neither of those things happens quickly. And we're not talking about, you know, it might take a year or two or maybe even 5. We're talking generations. Because if you go back and you look at, you know, when I think that the oldest general environment law among the ASEAN member states is in Philippines, 1988, right? That's a generation ago. That's one generation already, you know? And you know, and that I'm not, and this is not a judge, but that law has not been updated. It may be because it is, you know, it's still fully, you know, adequate for the Philippines, you know, even today, and doesn't need to be updated. But again, at the same time, there are, you cannot say that these things are going to happen quickly, and that they're not going to happen without a lot of effort. And it's going to take individual effort, and it will take group effort. Within ASEAN, there can be I guess you could call it peer pressure. Do you know what I mean? As individual ASEAN member states begin to take their own measures, and they may be, other ASEAN member states will take notice. But again, within ASEAN, you know, because there's no interference in affairs, that ASEAN member states are not going to try to impose what they do on any issue on any other ASEAN member state. So, you know, for your questions about, particularly with traditional knowledge and you know, and the human rights that are bound up with biodiversity conservation, these are things that, you know, if those of us who are serious about it, you know, we spend our lives doing it, and we know that it may be our life. Do you know what I mean? That's, you know, and we won't see the end of it, or we won't maybe even see what we hoped for by the end of our working life. You know, somebody used to ask, you know, people used to ask me what it was like, you know, and I'd say it's, you take one baby step forward generally, and then you take 3 giant steps back. And I don't mean to be pessimistic, but that's often the way it feels. But that also is a little bit of a reflection of the fact that these are processes, and anything that has to do with regulation is very dependent on the government that is administering any given country at any given time. And governments change every 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and priorities can change. I know I worked in one country where it took them 17 years to get their wildlife law enacted. And this was a coalition. It was it was not in ASEAN. This was on another continent, but it was a group. It was someone from the Attorney General's office, someone from the Parliament's legal drafting section, a university professor, and somebody else. And they formed their own little informal coalition. And there were 5 of them. They kept at it for 17 years. That's almost a generation. So I'm not I'm definitely not the person who's here to offer anybody a quick fix, because I've never seen one.
Thanks for those. So we're going to move on to a couple of other questions. So we've got a question from Sandy Akamo and another question from Rocky Guzman about marine issues. So can I ask Rocky Guzman to first ask your question, and then Sandy will come to yours. And I want to finish off after leave a little bit of time because there was another question asked about compliance and enforcement, which I thought was a really good question that we can come to at the end. But Rocky and Sandy. Rocky, did you want to ask your question first, and then Sandy?
Sure, Matthew. Thanks, Patty. My question is really like in the context, like with the renewed interest in getting vaccines, for example, from marine resources, and there are initiatives for bioprospecting. So I was thinking, how would the law and the regulations differ if applied to the marine context? Because I would imagine it would be different because there are no clear-cut users of traditional knowledge as opposed to terrestrial resources, and also the benefit sharing, since there are no indigenous peoples per se over marine resources. So I was interested if there were any examples of how it's applied in the marine context in the region, or perhaps anywhere else in the world.
Well, no, I'm pretty sure that even in ASEAN, there are indigenous fishing communities. I'm pretty sure. Coastal, and they may not be large groups, but I think there are at least examples in some communities, particularly in Indonesia. But if you ask me if I know of any specific examples, of how that's what I don't. Particularly with respect to marine resources, marine connectivity, which has been studied for a long time, but is really only beginning to be understood and appreciated, in the context of marine protected areas, as well as fishing resources and just managing fish stocks. That work is ongoing. IUCN has a group that's been working on marine connectivity for, I think it's been a formal group for 2 or 3 years now, something like that. And it's that I'm not familiar with the latest things that have come out, but I can check with somebody who is a member of that group, and I can let you know what they're doing. So I can't give you a specific answer to your question right now, Rocky, but I can ask people who may have one.
Thanks, Patty.
Thanks, Patty. And can I just more of a general question about the application of the biodiversity laws to marine protected areas. Are they often considered separate? Do we have separate laws for marine protected areas and marine biodiversity, or terrestrial? It's one of those questions we often face.
Yeah, depends on the country. Yeah, this is why I say, it's great to do these overviews at the regional level or do the global biodiversity outlook, but when it comes down to answering a specific question, it depends on the country. Some countries have their marine protected areas as part of a national protected area system. Some countries have marine protected areas as a completely separate system, totally. So that the terrestrial protected areas would be managed under one law, and marine protected areas, if they're managed separately, tend to be managed under the fisheries law, and they also tend to get conflated with fish conservation zones and other conservation measures that are taken specifically for exploiting the resource rather than conserving it. So it's a little bit, when you have your marine protected areas managed by the fisheries ministry, which is supposed to be trying to maximize the income from fisheries resources, there is a little bit of a tension there, and I think you can imagine that, no? So but then when you have your marine protected areas that clearly, some of them will have coastal areas associated with them, then where does coastal end and marine begin? Is it the high tide area? And again, this depends on how different countries define their coastal zone. And on some islands, the entire island, which can mean the entire country, is the coastal zone. Do you know what I mean? So again, there's no single answer for how you do that. But the biggest issue is, if you do have two different systems of protected areas, marine and terrestrial, how do you make sure that the government authorities responsible for those two different systems communicate effectively with each other to ensure that there is effective management? Because if protected areas, inland protected areas, are not managed effectively, and also areas outside protected areas, there will be runoff impacts on the coastal zone and marine areas and marine protected areas. There definitely needs to be, I mean, this is 25, 30 years old, the old ridge to reef. Do you know what I mean? You can't look at a country's marine area in isolation of what's happening on land in that country. So, but the fact that in, I would say, probably the majority of governments, most ministries operate in their silos, and there may be lots of interministerial commissions, and those will be as effective as the ministers who are involved at any given time, and also as effective as the prime minister or the deputy prime minister, whoever is responsible for the interministerial commission, makes it. Do you know what I mean? Because that person would need to call it, convene it, and bring the members in. So again, I mean, this goes back a little bit to Miko's question and other questions. There's no one single answer. There are definitely answers that are not going to be solved by environmental law. Environmental laws can certainly help you and can give you a basis for doing what you want to do, but even once you have your law, and even once your law says exactly what you want it to say, you have to make sure that it's applied and enforced. And that's what Matthew said was going to be the next question, right?
Okay, so so we got a question from Sandy Akamo.
Okay. Thank you,
please.
Matthew. This is a follow-up to what Rocky was saying about ABS laws, rules and regulations. So I'd like to ask, what is the level of implementation of this law in the ASEAN that gives them the push of taking it further in the currently being enacted or formulated law of biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction? Because currently the G77, where the ASEAN is a member of, is really having a hard time against the SIDS, the small island development states, and considering that ASEAN adopts or that's where the hotspot is on biodiversity. So that's my question. Thank you.
Okay, so you're asking what I'm not, because I couldn't hear everything clearly. Matthew, could you? I'm not.
The question in terms of biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions,
right?
Because there's obviously that discussion going on within the oceans continent. I mean, is ASEAN looking at any of these policies and these frameworks or ideas going,
Yeah.
being brought into that that debate or that discussion.
Particularly the ABS law.
The ABS.
Thank you.
Oh, access to genetic resources and benefit sharing. So, so we're talking about access to genetic resources and benefit sharing beyond national jurisdiction, and is ASEAN working on that?
What I'm saying is, what is the implementation, the level of implementation of the access benefit sharing in ASEAN that will give them the push to move this upward into the BBNJ. So it's like after reviewing implementation in their own jurisdictions, then how can they push it towards the implementation in BBNJ?
Okay. So you're asking first about the level of implementation of access to genetic resources benefit sharing in ASEAN, and then how would that translate into BNJ, right?
Yes,
okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, sorry. It's just like the connection was not really good, and I wanted to be sure I got your question before I said something. First of all, the level of implementation, I don't have enough up-to-date information about specific implementation of ABS in all ASEAN member states to give you the kind of answer that I think you're looking for. I can give you some snapshots. For example, Lao PDR that has not yet been able to formally regulate ABS, nonetheless now has designed its own contract for anyone who comes in and and wants to access genetic resources. They are the ministry is working on developing their standard terms. They have right now active, I think, only 5 or 6 contracts for access to genetic resources, and that have benefit sharing provisions in them. But every country has its own way of regulating, and and therefore it's not always straightforward to be able to get or access directly information on the level of implementation. I see that Professor Lai Lin Heng is here. She may have more information on implementation of ABS at the individual ASEAN member state level. As you were saying, how is this going to translate into areas beyond national jurisdiction? That is a question that as Matthew and you have pointed out, the entire world is still wrestling with. I don't think there are any clear answers yet. Everybody's still working on it. But I think what your question implies is that if ASEAN member states are not effectively and equitably implementing their own national measures on access to genetic resources and benefit sharing, it will be difficult when it comes time to expand that to areas beyond national jurisdiction. Is that where you were going?
I think in a way that's it. Although I'm saying is that the protection too, not just the exploitation of genetic material, but then the protecting our genetic material, because there are a lot of poaching going on, and then the improper patent with the source not even properly recognized.
Oh yeah, and clearly for particularly for the smaller the smaller countries in ASEAN, there are opportunities for for enforcement on a contract. For example, let's just say a European company signs an agreement, signs a contract to access genetic resources from a small ASEAN country, takes those back and then does whatever it pleases with them. And and I've had lawyers in countries just say, like, we can't even afford to go to arbitration. We have an arbitration clause in the contract, but we can't afford it. International arbitration is simply beyond the scope of what our government could do. So there are also practical limitations. I mean, even where the agency that's responsible in a country is doing the best it can given the resources that it has. So again, and we're getting to what Matthew was saying, the compliance and enforcement question that comes at the end. Even then, it may be beyond the scope of what an individual country could do to be able to defend its interests and its rights. And when you get beyond areas of national jurisdiction, it's even more complicated, obviously. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks for those questions. Professor Laling, again, one of our great environmental law champions. Now that Patty has mentioned you and called, would you like to make any comment?
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say hello to my special friends, Amado, John Boyd, and yourself, and Patty. Of course, I'm delighted to be here. I'm no great authority, but I would say I agree with all that Patty has said. I mean, firstly, if you look at the national level, I think there are quite a few countries that Patty pointed out do not have laws on access and benefit sharing. And I think this is important because I think each country needs to set up a system. And Patty rightly pointed out that in Singapore, we do it through permits. So basically, you can't come in to do anything in Singapore unless you get a permit, right? But I think a question that has not been addressed, and it's a difficult question, is what the participants have raised in relation to the marine environment. Because when we talk about access and benefit sharing, I think we are at the moment just thinking of the terrestrial. But there are important issues, same issues, but how do you regulate, access and benefit sharing in a marine context? It's very difficult practically, even though you have the laws. I mean, these people just go and take what they want, whereas, it's easier in relation to the terrestrial environment. So I think that's important. Those countries that don't have these laws, I think should be a priority. But actually, I wanted to ask Patty a question regarding EIA legislation. I came on, unfortunately, a bit late, so I don't know if there was any mention of EIA laws. I think it would surprise many of you that Singapore is the only country in ASEAN that does not have an EIA law. And we environmental lawyers are pushing very hard for an EIA law, but the government says, oh, we do EIAs, but it's not good enough for lawyers, right? It shouldn't be on an ad hoc basis as and when they feel like it. But what is good is that the National Parks Board has now come up with biodiversity impact guidelines. But again, these are all guidelines. Anyway, my question is, and I am prompted because I remember in one of the training programs we did for government officials, and there were some lawyers and there were others who were not lawyers. A chap from Sri Lanka told us, he said, I wish we were like Singapore. We don't have an EIA law. You can do so much more when you don't have an EIA law. And he said, in Sri Lanka, we have so many problems because of the EIA law. All the NGOs object and the process takes a very long time. And we have had people who wanted to invest in our country saying, I give up. I can't function in your country. I'm taking this project elsewhere. And my answer to him was very simple. I said, I don't know the details of your EIA law, but it seems to me it's not properly crafted. You need to have specific timelines. You cannot let the people, the public participation part overwhelm the whole process such that you can't move forward. But my question is, in relation to EIA laws in the ASEAN region, which country do you think has the best laws? We know the constraints. You see, the consultants, who pays for the consultants, for example? This is a process that can be abused, right? He who pays the piper calls the tune, So how do we ensure a good EIA law in practice and in substance and in implementation. Thanks very much, Patty.
Is that your only question, Lynn? Oh, that's no problem.
So,
No,
Patty,
yeah.
can I just sort of interrupt to give you a little bit of an out in the time, the few minutes we have available, is to say that our next.
Matthew.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
No, Matthew just froze, I think.
Yeah, he just froze.
Yeah, Matthew.
Oh dear.
Matthew froze. Well, let me tell you just quickly.
Focused on that. So just to say, you can say, please stay tuned for the next environmental law lecture.
Yeah.
You may want to think about that in terms of your comment about linking EIA with biodiversity protections or even land use planning.
Yeah. And since we're in an Asian Development Bank webinar right now, I've been working with ADB now for 10 years on environmental and social safeguards, and I've looked at all the environmental safeguards of all the ASEAN countries and then some, and I will go back and say nobody is the best. Do you know what I mean? Like there are some things that Sri Lanka actually does pretty well. But okay, that said, the Asian Development Bank has also started the process of reviewing and updating its environmental and social safeguards, and that process started third, fourth quarter of last year and will be ongoing all through this year. So, and there will be a lot of public consultation as part of that process. So that will be another opportunity for everybody who's in this webinar to think about these things, not only in the context of what you would like to see ADB doing, but also what ideas you could take from these consultations and take them back to your own countries. Again, what we were talking about, you know what I mean? Like listen to what other people are saying, what's being done in other countries, what ideas come from maybe even other parts of the world, take it back and then translate it into your own reality at home.
In fact, may I just say just very quickly, I think that's a great idea because it occurred to me that maybe we should have also a book relating to ASEAN, documenting what are good laws and cases from the different ASEAN states. For example, in the Philippines, I'm impressed with your writ of Kalikasan. And I think, I'm speaking as an academic that we can learn from the different countries, so if there are interesting cases, and of course we can start with your POSA case, which, in today's language, we can say it went viral many years back. So it would be interesting. So that could be a possible project that ADB might want to do. That's all.
Thank you very much, Layden. And can I also say that, one of the things that we've been trying to do with this Environmental Law Champions lecture series is really to try and look at some of these regional approaches. As someone who has worked in the region about 10 years, sort of half the time that Patty has, and certainly less time than Layling and others have, from an Australian background, I have been struck by the commonalities, but also the differences. And some of those ideas that Patty has mentioned is that the value in bringing together, looking at that comparative analysis. It's one of the things that we did with the India Environmental ETTT program, bringing together some of these ideas. So our next presentation, which will be on environmental impact assessment, will bring together sort of a regional examination of ASEAN. And I still remember when I first came to a meeting about EIA, we had 10 countries, all of which saying, we do it differently, we've got nothing in common. But when you go into it, as Patty's work, it shows there are a lot of commonalities, a lot of things that can be used. But as Patty said, we have to avoid falling into the idea of model laws, but we can think about things that work, things that are practically able to function in our respective national jurisdictions or state jurisdictions or local jurisdictions. And certainly that's something I've learned very much from the Philippines about the role of local communities in being able to make a huge difference because of their implementation of various activities, whether it's bike lanes or air pollution or recycling or biodiversity protection. I would like, I know there's a couple more questions, but I would like to say thank you very much, Patty. We've been here for an hour and a half talking about biodiversity law on a Saturday. So thank you very much indeed, Patty, for your presentation and the answers to the questions, and thank all the participants for your questions. It's been a great pleasure, and I always find it extraordinary. Having been an environmental lawyer for a long time, I still find it fascinating how much there is to learn. So Patty, thank you very much indeed for your presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Can I also say that when Patty mentioned the red list, we've got a few websites that are in the chat box. I've also put up a link to an Eventbrite, a webinar that's going to happen on Wednesday, which will look at wildlife protection. That's a free webinar, so you'll please join, and you're welcome to join. Can I also say that Patty's presentation will be uploaded on the website, teachenvirolaw.asia, and I think Angela will put that website up. And if you want a certificate, Angela will also put up the email. If you could send your full name to the email, apparently it's all done technically. So please, Angela will put up the Gmail address, and if you could send your name to that address for the production of the certificates of attendance for this workshop. Perhaps in closing, I want always to be optimistic. Patty mentioned 17 years to get biodiversity law up in one country. We know it's a long challenge. But when Patty mentioned the idea of ecosystems, there was a recent report in Australia that they did a review of 20 ecosystems within Australia and found that 19 were close to functional collapse. I think it's fair to say that we still have to remember that we are at a crisis point. This year is the Conference of Parties for the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was signed and approved in 1992, along with the Framework Convention of Climate Change. How climate change links into biodiversity conservation is something that we're grappling with at the moment as animals and assemblages are threatened by climate change, but also urbanisation. The classic problems of urbanisation, of concreting roads and fragmentation of biodiversity, the issues of the plundering of the seas, the issues of exploitation of resources beyond areas of national jurisdictions. These are all key issues, and above all, we need, as environmental lawyers or environmental activists, to get involved, to stay well involved and well focused on the important thing, which is the protection of biodiversity. Can I thank again, Patty? Can I thank all of our questionnaires? Can I thank our participants, the Asian Development Bank, for Angelo and Christina for organising it? Can I please say, go to the website next week when Patty's presentation is up. There's a wealth of material, and the video recording of this will also be online on YouTube. Again, thank you very much for giving up your Saturday. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, which thank you, Lai-Ling, for giving us that introduction for environmental impact assessment. And I'm sure it will be a very interesting, challenging look at EIA within Southeast Asia. But thank you all again very much, and please have a very safe weekend. And our thoughts are very much with our colleagues from Myanmar, who are at the moment going through a very, very difficult time. And environmental protection is one of the things that we have to think about in times of significant political crises. But thank you very much again for all your participation. Thanks, Patty. Look forward to welcome you again, and good afternoon and good morning. Thank you.
Thank you and bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. See you on Wednesday.
Thank you very much.
Matthew, did you still want to talk after the meeting?
Yes, if you can stop the broadcast stream, that would be great.
Yes, I already did.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Nice to see you.